what they mean. The reason that Darwinian evolution implies the apparent design of living systems is an illusion is because it doesn't have the resources to produce anything that is actually designed. All right? Obviously there are going to be people who disagree with that conclusion. If something appears designed, one view is it only appears so, and the other view is it really is. And the same issue arises all the time with human action, depending on whether it's accidental or intentional, which is the area of my expertise. So I agree with that, and also very much with the fact that you neither mandate nor prohibit teaching about the scientific disagreement. People need just simply the freedom to present the information that they believe is relevant on both sides of the controversy, and the goal is properly informed students. And you cannot have properly informed students on a controversy unless they know of both sides of the controversy. And that's what it means to be neutral and non-ideological.
Did you want to conclude with this slide? Or?
Yeah. I will argue that methodological naturalism, though those words do not occur there, the concept does, and the strikeouts that have been proposed by the Minority Report do remove that. They are correct to remove that because methodological naturalism prevents students from being properly informed on matters of scientific controversy, failure of full disclosure. It's not neutral and non-ideological because it advocates a single perspective on a controversial issue, and it fails to be secular because it will favor, even if that's not its intention, it will favor secular humanism and other naturalistic religions over theistic and other non-naturalistic religions by only allowing the evidence that favors the former religions to be presented.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manouch. Mr. Oganagari, your witness.
Thank you. Sir, I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you for the record, please. What is your personal opinion as to what the age of the Earth is?
I don't know, and that's my final answer.
Do you have an opinion as to what the age of the Earth is?
I'm not giving an opinion.
I didn't hear you.
I'm not giving an opinion.
You don't have then a personal opinion as to what the age of the Earth is?
I have no opinion.
Do you find that to be rather an oddity since you consider yourself an expert on all these areas?
No, absolutely not, because my understanding of historical sciences has led me to, studying them from the perspective of philosophy of science, has led me to believe that inference to the best explanation is much less certain than other areas of science. And so the conclusions are much more tentative, and there are other competing explanations that can be provided.
Do you accept the general principle of common descent, that all life is biologically related back to the beginning of life?
Not as defined by neo-Darwinism, no.
Do you accept that human beings are related by common descent to pre-hominid ancestors?
I doubt it.
What is the alternative explanation?
Well, there are a number of alternative explanations. Right now, as this book shows, there are views looking at self-organization which don't necessarily agree with that viewpoint. They may or they may not. But there is also the idea of design.
And your opinion as to when that design occurred?
I don't know.
It is true, is it not, that nowhere in Draft 2 is the term naturalism mentioned?
That is absolutely correct. That term doesn't occur, but the concept does.
Where in draft 2 does it say or imply that a student cannot hold a theistic view about the results and process of science?
It doesn't say that, but methodological naturalism will only give them the evidence that supports non-theistic religions. I'm not accusing the state of Kansas in any way of trying to establish religion. I'm simply saying the standards as written now will tend to favor those who have certain religious persuasions by allowing only their evidence congenial to their views to be presented.
And where in the standards does it mention methodological naturalism?
Does not use those words, but as I mentioned before, the concept does appear on Roman numeral page 10 and also page 98 of the Kansas Science Standards.
Would you agree with the following? There are many issues which involve morals, ethics, values, or spiritual beliefs that go beyond what science can explain, but for which solid scientific literacy is useful. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly fine statement, but it does not deal with the issue which is deletion of something in the standards. This is a good addition. I'm glad you have it. But what we're discussing is deletion of statements that imply methodological naturalism.
Draft 2 clearly states what science is and what science isn't. Draft 2 does not mention either guided or unguided, leaving the student to have a theistic view. It's the minority report that adds an atheistic definition of science and draft that rejects that addition?
I don't think the minority report does that. It simply explains to the student how the term biological evolution is understood by the majority of scientists.
Then let me ask you this. How do you explain the large number of theists, including evangelical Christians, who are scientists that do not see the methodological naturalism as a conflict with their faith?
Well, there's a couple of issues here. One is that the mere fact that you have somebody who holds two beliefs, A and B, does not show that they are logically consistent. So it might be that some of these people are confused. The other issue is, as this debate shows, this area is extremely controversial. So I expect they've worked it out because they've adjusted other of their assumptions in various areas. And some of my friends hold exactly the view that you hold. I don't think they're bad or stupid people.
Are you familiar with Mr. Michael Denton?
Yes, sir, I am.
I'm going to read you something, and I want you to tell me whether or not you agree with this. In his advocacy of special creationism, I believe Johnson, and you know who Philip Johnson is, don't you?
Yes, of course.
Is merely the latest in a succession of vigorous creationists, advocates who have been very influential within Christian conservative circles, particularly in the United States during the 20th century. None of these advocates, however, has had any lasting influence amongst academic biologists. This is not because science is biased in favor of philosophical naturalism, but because the special creationist model is not supported by the facts, and it is incapable of providing a more plausible explanation for the pattern of life's diversity in time and space that is evolutionary competitor. The reason why no current member of the United States National Academy of Science is a special creationist is because of the facts. The same facts that in the 19th century convinced Wallace and Darwin and all leading Christian biologists, including Joseph Hooker, Asa Gray, and Charles Lyell, of the reality of descent with modification. Do you disagree with that statement?
I think it mischaracterizes Johnson's position.
You cited in your discussion the Smith case. Were you referring to the Smith case out of Louisiana?
No, the Board of Commissioners of Alabama.
Of Alabama.
Let me refer to that. This is early on in my discussion. I have to recall where I referenced that in my report. Yeah, Smith versus Board of Commissioners of, John, is that correct? Of Alabama. You're a lawyer. I saw that and numerous other sources when I was researching the legal side of it. Yeah, here it is. It's Board of Commissioners of Mobile County, 655 F Sup 939 SD, Alabama, 1987.
Would you read that site again, the 6 what?
655 F Sup 939, and this was Alabama, 1987.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Nothing further.
Dr. Manouche, I heard you state that methodological naturalism is basically equivalent to philosophical naturalism. Did I understand that correctly?
In its effect, they are not equivalent as philosophical theses, but in its educational effect, methodological naturalism is going to present only the evidence which supports philosophical naturalism. So in its effect on education, it is going to be the same.
Do most philosophers, you're a philosopher of science? Is that...
Yeah, well, that's one of my areas. Really, my main focus is agency.
Then still, since we're dealing with science, do most philosophers of science agree with you that they are basically the same in their effect, how they interact at the education level?
Well, I haven't surveyed them all sociologically, but it seems to me it's a logical inference. If you only present the evidence in favor of something, you are advocating it, even if you then say, oh, but you're free to believe otherwise. In other words, you're free to believe otherwise, but with no evidence.
So is neo-Darwinian evolution, as most evolutionists understand it, does it have religious connotations?
Yeah, it has religious implications, because if it's taken to be the full account of everything that we observe, it implies that nothing is designed or has a purpose, that human beings in particular are just occurrences, we're products of this random process, and that we have no preordained value, meaning, or significance. Therefore,
Would you say that by adding elements of the minority report that would more adequately prepare students to distinguish between those religious and philosophical claims?
Yeah, no, I think that's very important. The important thing is to disclose where an assumption is made, what its consequences are, and then allow discussion of the arguments for and against. The worst thing is not to disclose it, have everybody assume it's a fact when in fact it's a controversial philosophical thesis. Get it out in the open, and then people can discuss both sides of it.
So, as many, that's perhaps the wrong word, as some evolutionists propose neo-Darwinian evolution, and as they would present it, would you classify that as a dogma?
Well, the dogma is really the methodological naturalism, because it's meaning that they can only present one-sided evidence. So it converts what is inherently a perfectly scientific theory into a dogma.
Dr. Manouj, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We're going to break for lunch. Mr. Calvert, Mr. Irgonagaray, do you have a problem about coming back at 1 o'clock instead of 1:05?
That works.
Okay. We're going to break and be back promptly at 1 o'clock. Also, I'd like to remind you to shut off your cell phones again. I suspect most everybody turned them on over the noon hour. Shut them off. Mr. Calvert, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Abrams, members of the committee, Mr. Gonagai, members of the media and the public. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Warren Nord, who is a professor of theology and religion at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Nord, welcome, and I appreciate your coming across the country to testify today.
I'm happy to be here.
I wonder if you could elaborate a bit upon your background to sort of get your testimony started.
I would be happy to. I received my bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Minnesota, and then my PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I like Chapel Hill so much I decided that I was going to stay if there was some way that I could. And so far I've managed to stay there. For 25 years I directed an interdisciplinary program called the Program in the Humanities and Human Values, which was an effort to bring people together from various humanities disciplines, and in fact people in the humanities together with people outside the humanities in the professions and the sciences, and particularly in education, to talk about human values and those fundamental concerns that we have that are part of being human. And certainly that experience has shaped my work a great deal. I place a tremendous amount of emphasis on interdisciplinary discussion, and that will shape my response to the concerns we have here this weekend.
Dr. Nord, could you give us a little bit better description of perhaps the associations you are connected with, affiliations, education, with regard to the issue of education, because I understand your degree is in philosophy, but you also have an emphasis on education.
Yeah, I teach the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of education. And some time ago I developed an interest in the relationship of religion and education, and that in fact has become my specialty. I started to write a book back in the mid-'80s on the humanities and the importance of the humanities to education. And the book was to have one chapter in it on religion, or more specifically on religious studies as one of the disciplines of the humanities. Well, as I started writing that chapter, it got longer and longer, and before long it had taken over the whole book. And that became my first book, called Religion and American Education, Rethinking a National Dilemma. The book has the merit. Well, I'm not sure that everyone would consider it a merit. Regardless of its merits in terms of quality, it does have the questionable merit, I suppose, of being the most comprehensive study ever done, I think, of religion and education, particularly secondary and higher education. I then followed that with a book called Taking Religion Seriously Across the Curriculum, which I co-wrote with Charles Haynes of the Freedom Forum First Amendment Center, in which we try and explain why religion should be taken seriously across the curriculum of public schools and how to do that properly. And since I think understanding that provides a good deal of perspective on how I come at this issue, it's worth my saying just a little bit about the kind of argument that I've made in those two books and in 30 or so articles and book chapters. I was surprised. I hadn't thought much about this issue of the relationship of religion and education at all until I started working on this book on the humanities. And as I started to do my research, I was surprised because a whole new way of looking at education emerged. One of the things that I've done is read over 80 high school textbooks in the sciences, in history, in economics, in health, in home economics, and virtually all of the national content standards that were issued primarily in the 1990s. And what I discovered was that neither in textbooks nor in the national standards was religion taken very seriously at all. Certainly, history textbooks and history standards include a fair amount of religion in the context of the fairly distant past, not much in the context of the 19th or 20th centuries. And textbooks and standards in all other disciplines virtually ignore religion. To give just one example that I'm going to draw on later in my remarks, economics. I think we have something to learn. It's an instructive example. I reviewed the national economic standards, which only make one reference. Well, let me say this. I think any religious person knows that religion has a great deal to do with economics, with how we understand human nature, how we understand society, how we understand the economic domains of life, how we understand morality and our obligations. One might expect that within an economics text or the economic standards there would be some reference to the religious context for thinking about economics. Of course, that's not the case. In 4,000 pages of 10 economics texts which I reviewed, if you add up all the references to religion, they total 2 pages, and none of the references are to any period later in time than the Protestant Reformation. So religion has no role to play at all in economics texts, nor does it in the economic standards, which only make one reference to religion in 45 pages as an example of a non-profit institution. Well, what does that mean? The problem is compounded, I think, by the fact that the national economic standards say that students should only be taught neoclassical economic theory. Now, some of you will know what that is. Neoclassical economic theory is the view that human beings are essentially self-interested utility maximizers, that the economic domain of life is a realm of competition between atomistic individuals, that moral judgments have to be reduced to cost-benefit equations in which there's some effort to maximize preference satisfaction. Well, none of that's compatible with any religious tradition in the history of the world. And yet the National Economic Standards say that's the only view of economics that students should be taught in American public schools. For, they say, to introduce any other view would only be to confuse students and teachers. Now, there may be an analogy between that, I think there is, and the problem that we're talking about this weekend. Part of my concern is to put this issue that we're discussing this weekend in a much larger perspective. In effect, what we do in public schools is conduct a kind of serial socialization. That is, within each discipline, we don't teach subjects. Subjects are open to various interpretations. We teach disciplines. Disciplines provide a single way of understanding the world. In science, it's shaped by methodological naturalism. In economics, by neoclassical economic theory. You can make the same kinds of arguments with how we teach literature, how we teach the arts, how we teach history, how we teach health. Students are not exposed to the wide range of issues that would be required if they were to have a truly liberal education. And in fact, there are 3 reasons why this is deeply wrong. The first is a liberal education should introduce students to the major ways humankind has developed for making sense of the world. Some of those ways are conservative, some liberal, some secular, some religious. Right now, public education is incredibly parochial. It basically only introduces students to secular ways of making sense of the world. It leaves religious voices out of the discussion. A typical way of thinking about liberal education is in terms of introducing students to various disciplines. So we have distribution requirements in college and in public schools, the requirement that students take history and literature, history and English, we call them social studies and communication arts or communication skills, and science and math. But there isn't any requirement that within each of those areas of study, students be required to understand different ways of interpreting the subject matter. We simply initiate them into a series of disciplines, what I call serial socialization. A liberal education would require interdisciplinary discussion. What is the relationship between what students learn in a science course and in an economics course, what they might learn about religion, what they might learn about morality in a philosophical ethics course, what they learn about human nature in a literature course? We never ask those questions. The whole structure of education is set up to keep students from being reasonable. Being reasonable requires that we're able to make judgments about the relationships of what we learn within various disciplines. Think if we only taught students how Democrats think about the world and never mentioned how Republicans think about the world. We all agree, I think, that would be, well, maybe we don't. Most of us agree that would be a bad education. To be educated about politics, you have to understand how Democrats and how Republicans think about the world. To be educated about economics requires understanding not just how neoclassical economic theorists understand the world, but how economics is understood within various political and ideological and religious traditions as well. We don't do that. Education isn't truly liberal. We make a feeble effort toward it. There's also a civic justice argument, and that is that in public schools in particular, there's an obligation to take the public seriously, not to disenfranchise people because of their views. I think there is a justice argument to be made for including the voices of all, at least major groups within our culture, including religious groups. We don't do that. A few years ago, we thought that it was all right to leave blacks and women out of the cultural conversation. I think we now all realize that's wrong. But what we still haven't come to realize is that it's wrong to leave religious voices out of the discussion. The problem is the same. It's disenfranchising people. It's saying we're not going to take your values and your views seriously. There's also a constitutional problem here, and that is the Constitution requires, ever since 1947 in Everson versus Board of Education, when Justice Black said, and the court has agreed with him ever since, that education, that the state must be neutral between religion and non-religion, not just neutral among religions, but neutral between religion and non-religion. The court has applied that idea to public education any number of times. There's never been any serious dissent to that idea within the court. What does it mean to be neutral with regard to religion and non-religion? Well, the only way I can make sense of that is in terms of being fair to the alternatives. There isn't any such thing as a neutral point of view. Rather, neutrality must mean fairness, taking different people, different cultures, different traditions seriously. Now, to wrap up this part, where this leads me is to the idea that public education must take religion seriously, must include religious voices in the conversation, not just in the context of the distant past, but now as live alternatives, as a matter of liberal education, as a matter of civic justice, and as a matter of constitutional neutrality. Please note these are all secular arguments. I'm not arguing that religion should be taken seriously for any religious reason whatsoever. This is also the middle way in our culture wars. That is, I'm opposed to both the idea of leaving religion out of the discussion and to the idea that religion should be promoted. Religion should be taken seriously among the various alternative ways of making sense of the world. I tell you this because I want you to know where I'm coming from, and now addressing more particularly the problem before us at these hearings. I make these comments not because I have any particular vested interest in intelligent design theory. I have my views and they'll become clear. But I come at this problem really out of my background concern to further an idea of liberal education, civil justice, and constitutional neutrality in public schools. Perhaps the most important implication of my view is that we completely misunderstand what science education should be. The purpose of science education should not be to train scientists. That's proper in upper-level undergraduate courses and in graduate school, but it's not proper in introductory courses in high school or indeed in undergraduate schools. The purpose of science education should be to further the liberal education of students. This has a number of significant implications. Think again about neoclassical economic theory. Is it proper to teach students just one way of thinking about the economic world, particularly when that way of thinking about it diverges so deeply and profoundly from other ways people think about the economic world? Obviously not. Similarly, it seems to me, a part of science education, as liberal education, should be to locate science within a larger interdisciplinary discussion that has to do with the major human problems that we all confront as we think about the meanings of our lives and the nature of reality. That is, science education as part of a liberal education should have a much broader purpose than what is ordinarily recognized. The majority report, which I have read in totality, says that does encourage critical thinking. But certainly within the context of the report, the idea is critical thinking within the domain of establishment science. There's nothing at least explicit about the idea of critical thinking about science and its relationship to other aspects of life and other disciplines within our intellectual life. The philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, who I think would be by clear consensus viewed as the greatest philosopher of science, the most influential philosopher of science of the 20th century, said in his most important book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that scientists are educated the most dogmatically of any group in our society with the exception of theologians. He's wrong, of course. They're educated much more dogmatically than our theologians. No theologian can get through college or seminary without encountering a lot of science. Most scientists get through their PhDs without ever encountering any kind of religious studies or theology or philosophy. Science education is typically highly illiberal, and that is a huge problem. A number of speakers before have mentioned the fact that nowhere in their educations were they ever encouraged to think critically about science. Rather, they were simply encouraged, initiated into scientific ways of thinking, rather uncritically. Okay. Now to dig down just a little bit deeper. Methodological naturalism. Happily, I don't have to say much here. I think Professor Manouche did a marvelous job. I agree entirely with him about methodological naturalism. It short-circuits critical thinking within science. So there's not only the problem of thinking about science from outside, but then there's the question of how do we think critically about science from within the inside. What, in fact, is to count as science. And we, in effect, uncritically teach students to accept a kind of methodological naturalism. By holding out for a naturalistic explanation, as the majority standards suggest that we ought to do, or presuppose that we ought to do, design explanations and teleological explanations of nature are ruled out of bounds a priori. Let me put it this way. If there is a God, and God created nature, there must be design somehow or another in the world. That is, given most conceptions of God, God is good, and God would create nature to fulfill God's purposes. There must be design inherent in nature. Methodological naturalism does not, as Professor Manouche said, allow us to find any of that evidence for design. It rules design out a priori. It converts science from being an empirical discipline to a dogmatic discipline, one which is passed on to other scientists and to other students really as a matter of faith. Now, this isn't a totally unreasonable faith. Naturalistic science has worked quite well in a lot of regards. It's not surprising that scientists have a fair amount of faith that it will continue to work well in the future. But by excluding design explanations or teleological explanations, it asserts a priori that it will continue to work well, and that really is a matter of a kind of faith. That is a trust that what has worked well in the past will continue to work well. Now, of course, some people will say it hasn't worked all that well in the past. We can distinguish between methodological naturalism and a philosophical naturalism or an overt atheism. The problem is that distinction, in effect, collapses given the way that we teach science. It's true that the majority report makes no reference to methodological naturalism, but I don't think that makes any difference to the points that I'm making that Professor Manouge made this morning. First of all, is that there's the response that Mr. DeHart made yesterday. Well, let me back up just a moment. The counsel for the majority has pointed out to a number of witnesses that the majority report has a statement in it that a student will understand that there are many issues which involve morals, ethics, values, or spiritual beliefs that go beyond what science can explain, but for which solid scientific literacy is useful. Presumably, the argument is that because the majority report makes that statement, it doesn't advocate methodological naturalism. I don't find that a convincing argument. First of all, as Mr. DeHart said yesterday, the fact that discrimination was viewed as wrong as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 doesn't mean that discrimination doesn't go on. The fact that the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal doesn't mean that we treat all people equally. The fact that there's a single statement like that in the majority report doesn't mean that everything else in the report doesn't undercut that particular statement. So that's one problem with it. A second problem with it is that many intellectuals in the 20th century, and I suspect a whole lot of other folk, have accepted that view, said, yes, science can't tell us anything about morals, ethics, values, or spiritual beliefs, but what science can do is tell us everything about the world, about nature, and about reality. And what was the response to that? The response to that is, therefore, morality and values and ethics don't have anything to do with the world. They're things that we make up. So one way of reading this statement is to suggest that, yes, it's true, science can't account for morality and ethics, but since science can account for everything in the world, presumably, there's no suggestion that it can't, in nature, that means that morality and values can't be grounded in nature or grounded in reality. So it can lead to a view which is very destructive of most moral and religious beliefs. And then finally, as I said, unless a lot is done to make students aware of the difference between methodological and philosophical naturalism or atheism, a single statement like that just isn't going to make much difference. And again, Professor Manouge talked about that a great deal this morning. The inevitable idea that they will acquire from their studies is that science can explain everything about the natural world. And as he also pointed out, it's somewhat more dangerous and pernicious when that assumption is not made explicit, but simply becomes part of the background understanding which people acquire unconsciously without being able to think critically about it. And maybe one other argument, too, is that even if that statement is in the majority report, still teachers use the standard textbooks and curricula where that distinction is completely lost sight of. And that has to be assumed that the context then within which biology or the life sciences will be taught is one in which a kind of purposeless neo-Darwinism is the assumed way of thinking about the world. One other comment about the majority report. I must say that John Calvert misled me about one thing. And that is, when I did read the majority report, I discovered that it was rather worse than he had led me to believe. It's worth noting that the majority report leaves out mention of all those aspects of scientific understanding of nature which are deeply problematic and which are incredibly important to our understanding of the significance of science. So, for example, even though the Big Bang isn't mentioned by name, there's certainly reference to the Big Bang, but there's no mention of the problem of the origins of the Big Bang. There is a fierce debate raging about whether or not there's fine-tuning in the aftermath of the Big Bang, and many cosmologists and philosophers and some theologians have come to believe that there is fine-tuning, that the Big Bang was set up in a certain way in order to lead to life. This is an incredibly important argument. There's no mention of that. There's no mention of the origins of life or the inability of science to currently account for them. There's no mention of possible alternatives. Granted, we need to think critically, but to design theory or any alternative explanation for evolution. There's no mention of the huge problems of how consciousness comes to be. This is a problem which has concerned many philosophers, which is completely unresolved, and although many philosophers have come to believe that science simply can't account for consciousness or rationality, which Professor Manouche again touched upon this morning. Moreover, even though there's a standard devoted to the personal perspectives, certainly the most important personal perspective for most people with regard to science is its implication on their religious beliefs. There's no mention of that. Certainly the most important culturally implication of science is its relationship to religion and morality. This is a debate that's been going on ever since the origins of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. That's the most important thing to understand about the history of science. There's no mention of that. There is one reference to the idea that technology poses risks instead of benefits, but it doesn't raise the huge problem that we have in our culture and our society today of technological thinking. Part of what gets us into so many problems today is we inevitably think technologically about the world rather than morally or spiritually. No reference to that. Oh gosh. I've got a few more things I could say, but maybe, John, this is a place to stop and let you ask me any questions you want to. I do want to say something about intelligent design theory, but you might want to ask me about.
Well, one thing, would you just again express your view as to the extent to which, in practice and effect, methodological naturalism collapses into a philosophical naturalistic view?
Well, I think Professor Manouche stated it beautifully this morning. It limits a priori, it limits as a matter of definition the kind of evidence that's available to students or indeed other scientists who kind of get trapped into the dominant paradigm. And when that's the case, they aren't in a position in which they can critically assess the accepted theory. It's no different from saying if we only taught students about what Republicans believe about the world, how in the world could they think seriously about Democrats or whether or not Democrats should be taken seriously? Or neoclassical economic theory, or anything else. If you only have one view available to you, that view then becomes passed on more or less as a matter of uncritical faith and trust that at some point in the past it was able to handle these kinds of problems, but who knows, because we aren't introduced to the problems. And so by failing to take seriously the idea that there are alternatives, the conventional wisdom becomes maintained as a matter of authority and faith rather than critical reason and good liberal education.
Would you comment a bit about your views on the standard on page 4? Well, first of all, I assume based on what you say, well, first I want to move to this provision that according to many scientists, core claim of evolutionary theory is that apparent design of living systems is an illusion. Other scientists disagree. These standards neither mandate nor prohibit teaching of this scientific disagreement. Do you agree? What are your comments about that statement?
I believe actually that something stronger is required ideally. That is to say, I think, as part of a liberal education and indeed as part of sorting out what is reasonable to believe within science, students need to be introduced to these kind of boundary questions about what's really science, the controversy about whether it's really science, and then given whatever significant alternative theories there are for making sense of whatever evidence is available. Making it a matter of permission is probably all right now, in part because many teachers aren't prepared to do this. But the ideal towards which we should be working is a more liberal conception of making sense of science, one that fits better within the liberal education model that I suggested. And so that I think in the long run, if we take this ideal seriously at some point, when resources become available and teachers are properly educated to deal with these kinds of questions, it should be required that students learn something about intelligent design theory, which is, after all, I mean, this is not, sometimes this is portrayed as just a minor skirmish on the borders of science, but it isn't. Again, that's because we're thinking basically in terms of traditional science education rather than in terms of liberal education. This is simply the latest variation on a huge intellectual battle that has gone on, goes all the way back to Greek philosophy and to the Bible about how we make sense of nature. Students need to be initiated into that discussion. That's a somewhat broader discussion, but that's the proper context for understanding why intelligent design theory is important now, not just as an alternative to neo-Darwinian evolution, but as part of a longer and tremendously important story, narrative in Western civilization about how we make sense of nature.
Do you believe the discussion of intelligent design should be accomplished within the context of the biology science classroom?
Yes. Where one handles other kinds of religious claims is tricky business. Simply the title of my second book, Taking Religion Seriously Across the Curriculum, suggests that religion should be taken seriously in most all disciplines. I used to say except mathematics and driver's education, but the Amish let me know that driver's education is religiously very important. And actually a case can be made for mathematics because in the philosophy of... No, I'm not going to get into that. Sure, it should be done in science courses because that's where the evidence... I mean, you can't relegate it to the history teacher. What in the world does a history teacher know about the relationship of intelligent design theory to neo-Darwinian biology? So it's got to be in science courses. It doesn't have to be approached as an equal competitor, but it has to be included in the discussion. Students need to be made aware of the fact that there are alternative conceptions, alternative theories for making sense of the evidence that are out there and available.
Would you agree with me that in order to discuss design theory on any scientific basis, that it would require the disciplines of science, biology, paleontology, geology, even to some extent statistics and mathematics. And the question that always troubled me about the idea of putting intelligent design in a different forum, such as a class in religion and philosophy, there are two concerns. One is that you bifurcate the discussion, and there's no guarantee that the audience that hears one will be the audience that hears the other. And the second problem is that, how can a theologian or a philosopher or a sociologist have the expertise necessary to, in any rational way, explain the criticisms for and against that?
I agree with you entirely about that. There is one fairly easy way of doing it, and that is textbooks. Most science textbooks include a perfunctory chapter on scientific method, which hardly ever deals with the relationship of science and religion. And if it does, it does in the crassest and most simple-minded ways. Those chapters could be well written to raise all kinds of, well, not all kinds of, but several important philosophical questions about demarcation questions about the relationship of science to other disciplines and controversies that are going on. That could be done easily, but it isn't because, of course, the scientific establishment won't allow it. Science establishment insists on illiberal education. Oh, that reminds me. Can I say something about liberals?
Sure.
Liberals and this whole question. All right, let me tell you outright, I am a liberal. Politically, I'm a liberal. Theologically, I'm a liberal. I'm a liberal in every sense. Some people would say worse than that. One of the things that really disappoints me is how this issue has gotten framed in terms of conservatives and liberals. The position I'm arguing for, it seems to me, is the liberal position. Science is notably illiberal, the scientific establishment in science courses. The idea of liberalism is including everybody in the discussion. I mean, that's what we went through with women and blacks and various ethnic groups. You include them in discussion. We left them out. We'd been illiberal. Now we've come to see through multiculturalism and all other kinds of movements within education over the last several decades that was wrong. It was wrong. It is tremendously important to include them in the curricular discussion. That's the liberal position. That's not the conservative position. The liberal position with regard to science education should be inclusivity, including more people into the argument. Why aren't they? Why aren't good liberals saying, yes, let's take intelligent design seriously? Part of it is naivete. Part of it is a kind of principled commitment to naivete about education. I mean, most scientists just don't think about these questions, I think. Secondly, a kind of principled adherence to a philosophical naturalism and not thinking clearly about the differences between methodological and philosophical. Part of it is simply fear. It's the fear that the religious right is going to get its big foot in that door and all kinds of trouble is going to come. That's not a very principled argument. The principled position is drawing the circle more widely, including more people. And this is finding common ground, and this is what we have to do if we're going to actually save public education. It's giving everybody a place at the table, giving everybody a voice in the discussion. One of the things that's amazing to me is how the scientific establishment hasn't realized yet that its policy doesn't work. That is to say, the Gallup polls show that only 9%, the last one I saw, believe in what comes closest to being neo-Darwinian evolution. Science education isn't working to make the point of view of the scientific establishment. People are deeply suspicious of science. People are deeply resentful of science because they feel their points of view aren't taken seriously. I actually think that if the conversation were broadened and we had a more reasonable discussion, people might actually take neo-Darwinian evolution a little bit more seriously. Although, since I myself do believe more for philosophical reasons, I guess I would say, than because of the intelligent design movement, I think that neo-Darwinian explanations of the world are inadequate. And maybe since I suspect my time is almost up, let me say one other thing, and that is, I know that the counsel for the majority report is going to ask me several questions in a few moments, and since you will not give me the opportunity to explain myself, I will do that right now. For the record, I believe the world is 4.5 billion years old, give or take a few hundred million. Secondly, descent from a common ancestor. The question here is, what does descent from mean? If that means if neo-Darwinian mechanisms are fully adequate for the explanation, I don't believe that. But if design or teleological explanations are allowed to count for explaining at least a part of what happens in evolution, then I accept that. And the same regarding our descent from pre-hominid ancestors. Yes, of course, I think that's true, but I think it's true only in the sense that I think we need to appeal to teleological explanations because neo-Darwinian explanations aren't adequate to account for all of that evolutionary development. All right, what else?
I have one other thing that you wanted to get into, and that was the definition of science. And what is your comment on who? I don't have it on the slide.
I was wary of doing this. One of the things that convinced me to do it was that Mr. Calvert told me I didn't have to agree with him about everything. I could simply say what I thought, which is what I have done. And one of the places I disagree, I suppose not greatly, but some, is with regard to the definition of science. That is to say, my view is that rather than have any definition of science, it would be better for the standards to say the definition of science is controversial. I would be inclined to say, let's let scientists decide how to define science. But of course, part of the problem is scientists disagree. There's certainly a majority view and a minority view, but there's a significant disagreement about how to define science. So it seems to me what's important is that students be initiated into the controversy. Again, this is what a liberal education requires. Let's let students know that the definition of science is controversial for the following reasons. Here's the different positions people take, rather than insisting on any particular correct definition of science. That said, if one has to pick between the majority report view and the minority report view, I certainly favor the minority report view.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nord, Mr. Ganagari, it's your witness.
It's 19 minutes.
I want to make sure, sir, that I understood your suggestions for a liberal education. Do I understand you to suggest that in order for science to truly be taught liberally, that it must include religion in its teaching?
The question is what you mean by include. On one meaning, yes. On another meaning, no. Science texts, like texts in economics or history or any other discipline, should locate students within an ongoing interdisciplinary discussion about how we make sense of the world. There should be an introductory chapter in textbooks which locate modern science within this kind of broad cultural conversation that's historical, that should introduce them to something of the history of science. The National Science Standards, the Kansas Standards, all have a history standard in it, yet that history isn't really taken, I think, very seriously. It's certainly not taken seriously in any kind of organized or systematic way. So that should be part of it. What is the history of science? How did science come to be what it is? And how does it relate to other ways of making sense of the world? And what are the controversies?
Excuse me, sir. I was just asking for a yes or no answer.
I'm sorry, you didn't say that. I took my chance.
I only have 19 minutes, and all I wanted to know was a yes or no answer.
Yeah, well, that's impossible because it depends on what you mean by include.
Okay, then just tell me that. I understand you to say that you believe intelligent design is or will be a valid hypothesis someday to be taught in colleges and university science curriculums?
No. I'll explain.
Would you be so kind, sir, as to tell me whether or not it is your opinion that the standards in Kansas, particularly as they're reflected in draft 2, include the following? There are many issues which involve morals, ethics, values, or spiritual beliefs that go beyond what science can explain, but for which solid scientific literacy is useful. That is included in the standards, is it not?
Yes.
And it is your opinion that that does not go far enough?
Yes.
Do the terms neo-Darwinism or Darwinism appear in the standards?
I don't believe so.
Does the term methodological naturalism appear in the standards?
Don't believe so.
Draft 2 also does not mention either guided or unguided, correct?
Correct.
Do you believe it is appropriate? Strike that, please. Are you familiar with Mr. Paul Nelson?
I have a vague understanding of who he is, yes.
Would you tell me if you would agree or disagree with his statement? Intelligent design proponents offer nothing to the scientific community upon which a scientific program can be developed. They don't even have a clearly defined definitions of critical terms that can be understood and applied by others. For example, they have provided no objective basis upon which others can apply concepts such as irreducible complexity or specific complexity. They focus on critiques of evolutionary theory that either attack, strawman views of evolution, misrepresent current science, or are simply based on flawed reasoning. They also point to areas of frontier science in which the scientific community is yet to reach a consensus. None of this constitutes any challenge to the predictive and explanatory power of evolutionary theory. With regard to intelligent design, there is simply no theory or anything approaching it. It is not used in scientific research, even by its primary proponents. All intelligent design is a series of failed and rejected criticisms of evolutionary theory. Easily, the biggest challenge facing the intelligent design community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have such a theory right now, and that's the real problem. Without a theory, it is very hard to know where to direct your research focus. Right now, we've got a big bag of powerful intuitions and a handful of notions, such as irreducible complexity and specified complexity, but as yet, no general theory of biological design. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
No. If someone had read that statement to Copernicus, we never would have gotten to a heliocentric view of the world.
And if Copernicus would have been held back by the then dogmatic view of those that controlled the faith, we would still believe the earth was the center of the universe, wouldn't we, sir?
No, my point was that even the kind of science that Copernicus used had to start somewhere. And one could have very well said, using the conventional wisdom of Copernicus' day, hey, there's no research program here. This isn't anything worth taking seriously. I mean, every effort to develop some kind of science has to start somewhere.